Hi everyone, this is Elias Martin of CollectingJapanesePrints.com. Welcome to Woodblock Wednesday, where every Wednesday we get together and discuss Japanese prints, paintings, or culture. And sorry for missing last week. Thanks all of you for sending me notes, just asking me what's up. Basically, I was doing a lot of traveling, business travel last week into this week, so that I'm running a little late today. I usually go live at 1 p.m. on Wednesdays. But today I was able to get my act together to put out a really nice group of prints to share with you. And now I'm back in town, and there shouldn't be any delays in the next few months with Woodblock Wednesdays, so you have something to look forward to in your Wednesdays. And so, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining me. We're celebrating fall. I'm here in Chicago, and the weather here is very fall-like today. And that inspired me to share with all of you four particularly beautiful woodblock prints that have a strong fall quality. And so without further ado, let's have a look. So the first print I want to discuss is a work by Koshiro Onchi. And this is his Leaf and Clouds design. I think it's known by the title Poem, Leaf and Clouds. He usually numbered the poems, and I forget which number that is. Forgive me. I'll include that in the comments for the appropriate title for the print. And this design was done after the war, done in 1953, and it's a really well-known design by Onchi. And basically, Onchi produced this print with found objects, or objects he had at the ready based on just whatever. He was known as a hoarder, and so he kept interesting pieces of paper or leaves in this case, or other things, thinking maybe one day he might use them in prints. And so after the war, Onchi primarily dedicated himself to abstract works of art. Of course, there's some really wonderful examples of non-abstraction. I've shared with all of you a portrait of the violinist design that was done after the war. But in this particular case, I would say about 1950, certainly by 1950 and on, Onchi's output was exclusively abstract. And in this particular print, what we have is clearly a pure work of abstraction. And we can get, I'll get into that a little bit later. But first of all, just pointing out, it's a work that Onchi used a leaf, and then there's this really wonderful pattern. And what looks like at first blush, string that's been inked and pressed. It's actually, that's what I used to think some time ago. And then, for some reason, I forgot. And then I revisited the Oliver Statler book on post-war Japanese works of art, or modern Japanese prints. And Oliver Statler really does a great job recounting how Onchi produced the design. And what Onchi did was, he had pieces of paper, wax paper, that he sort of saved from cigarettes. Apparently, these were just, the wax paper where cigarettes were contained in, and he unwrapped them and cut them out into some shapes. And here, we see some of the shapes. There's a triangular shape, and there's these sort of oval blobs. So here's the triangles, and here's the ovals. And what he did was he drew this out on a piece of paper, and once he was satisfied with the design, he took the design, laid it down, put a piece of clear glass so he could see through the glass and see his original design, and then he inked separately each element. So for example, in this particular case, this was done with a wax piece of paper, as I said, and he inked the edge of the wax paper so that when the piece of paper was placed in front of it, the pigment bled out at the edge and not throughout the design, just at the very edge. And he basically produced the entire background in that way. So he kept adding and removing the wax paper And he did not have a kento, meaning he did not have a guide that precisely told them where each element would be. It's a guide for registration. So he kind of did this freehand. And then he printed this leaf with more of a conventional way. He took the leaf, inked it, and it was attached to a piece of board, probably wooden board, and he placed the print over that portion and rubbed it. And of course, that's how you get the leaf. And so this design, one thing I'd like to sort of always bring up is this design represents, in a sense, it's abstract, 100%. But it also represents what is real. There is a real leaf, and there's these forms that kind of have a narrative quality to them, sort of invite the viewer to sort of create the print in their mind. But of course, at the same time, though this is a leaf, it's an abstracted work of art. And so there's this tension between what is real and what isn't, and it oscillates between those two ideas, which I find really intellectually compelling as well as beautiful. And Onchi produced this work in very limited quantities. I think he made maybe 10, 12 of these, and that was a very large edition. Usually Onchi produced, well, he was famous for producing monoprints, so there's a lot of works that he only produced one of, and of course there's several that are famous that he produced 10, 12, 15 of, and a lot of them, most of them are in museums. And this work is, there's a copy at the Art Institute of Chicago and other museums throughout the world. And I'm very fortunate to have this one to share with you. And so Onchi, he was sort of the father of abstraction in terms of print. He basically was credited with producing the very first work of abstraction in printed form in 1915, and he continued that interest throughout his career, though he wasn't able to express it for a good portion of it, because abstraction wasn't understood in Japan. It was also discouraged. But after the war, he found a new, fresh rebirth for his abstraction. And, Americans and all of the Western occupying forces that were in Japan were actually very interested in his artwork, and he sold his prints quite well during that time. So I'm going to zoom in so all of you could see the details, the fine details of this work. Here is Onchi's distinctive signature, Onzi. When he used a stamp signature, that's the stamp signature you need to see. Of course, there are copies of this design where he signed it in pencil. And so there's no one way where the way that this print comes. It comes in multiple ways. I've actually seen it stamped and signed. So again, there's no one way. Now, because this work is not just a work of abstraction, I also think it's noteworthy because Onchi utilized found materials in making the print. And one of Onchi's sort of colleagues, I would call him a disciple of Onchi's, because he really did follow Onchi very closely and worked with Onchi, may even stayed with him for a while. But his name is Gen Yamaguchi. And Gen Yamaguchi is also known to have started using found objects in his printmaking. Typically, there were leaves and other things like that. There's some pieces of cloth. And Onchi and Gen Yamaguchi started working in that sort of that style with using found objects at the same time. They've asked both Onchi and Gen Yamaguchi about that. And Gen Yamaguchi's like, basically they arrived at that idea roughly around the same time. And so I would say it's almost analogous to Picasso and Braque in how they worked with with cubism. And, so in this case, I'd like to share three other works with you that are done not by Onchi, but by Gen Yamaguchi, that are inspired with the same motif, with the same sort of materials. So the next work, as I said, is by Gen Yamaguchi. This was done after the war, I would say about circa 1950. So this one I think is a little bit earlier than this one, but there's this really interesting conversation occurring between Onchi's work and Gen Yamaguchi's. Now, Yamaguchi, the background, you can tell, it's actually a woodblock print. The texture gives that away. And but he also uses other found objects, like, for example, in this case, there's this really prominent, beautiful leaf, and it's printed in such realism that it almost looks like the leaf is an inclusion into the paper, but it's not. This is actually printed. And there's this really interesting line around the design of the leaf, and this looks like it was printed with a string. Whereas in this work, though it has a string-like quality, the ink actually bled from pieces of wax paper that were impressed. In here, it looks like Gen Yamaguchi carefully assembled a piece of string, inked it, and pressed it into the print. Here you have a really interesting sort of, it almost looks like an ink spot or of some kind, but this is also printed, as is this. There's kind of almost like a accidental sort of quality where it almost looks like it was ink that was splattered, but this was it is printed intentionally. And here on Onchi's print, it's fascinating because all the ink that oozed out from the wax paper, that was done in some sort of spontaneous kind of way. So Onchi could not control how far the ink moved away from the shape. There's a certain element of sort of discovery in the process of printing, which is accidental. I mean, I would call it almost like a controlled accident, where in this design, everything is very precise, though it has that spontaneous quality to the extent that you see that this leaf and the string, and it might at first blush looked just sort of thrown together. This is much more precise. It is calculated. You see how the string dissects this kind of form here. It's it's very carefully thought out. And at the bottom here, this area here is very distinctive for Gen Yamaguchi. He always used a square or kind of a blockish angular shape to anchor the entire composition. And this does sort of serve as an anchor. But again, it has a really interesting surface that echoes the surface of the leaf here. But this is a really interesting comparison because Onchi's print has this sort of free spirit, in the moment, spontaneous printing effect. And then Yamaguchi's is very calculating, very precise, very sort of mannered. And it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. It's just two very different approaches at printmaking with using found objects. And, as I said, both artists sort of acknowledged each other as sort of I don't want to say that they created this technique in printmaking, but they both came to it and popularized it in their own way at the same time. So, I think that's interesting. So the next print I'll share with you, also a work by Gen Yamaguchi. And at the end of my little talk, I'll go through each print again and zoom in so you could see the qualities of each print. In fact, I might just go back and just zoom in here so you could see, because we just talked about this design. And it's very hard to capture, but there's this really wonderful silver mica that's on the surface of the print, and I'll angle the phone in a way that you might be able to see it. It has a really wonderful shimmering effect to the design. Sorry, my phone is acting up and it's telling me to rotate a certain way. So I don't want to screw up the video here. But, again, you could take my word for it if you can't see it. But there's this silver mica. It's kind of a dusting of mica that's applied throughout the design that's really beautiful. Now, the next print, also by Yamaguchi. This is also done in the 50s. I would say this is about 1950, and this is closer to 1954. The paper's thicker. This paper is more absorbent and thinner. This is a nicer type of a quality of paper. This is more indicative of what was available after the war and a few years after the war. This is paper that any artist would be very proud to use. It's a thicker, more luxurious, high quality paper. And so this design, done in much the same way as this work, everything is calculated. Everything looks like it's been measured and precisely printed in the place where the Yamaguchi wanted it. And what you see here is this really wonderful form that's in the background. And the way that I think he produced it, this looks like a piece of cloth. And this is something that Onchi was known to have done. And I think Onchi really was the first artist to do this technique. And he used a piece of cloth and he inked it, and it's folded. You could kind of see the creases of the material throughout, which, it's interesting because knowing that it's a piece of cloth, it has a three-dimensional quality to it. And it's printed with such care. It also has this wonderful sense of light emanating from the work it's very hard to describe. And I hope that the video captures it somewhat. But in person, there's this really wonderful sense of light that seems to flow out. It's almost as if you're unwrapping an envelope or a package, and this beautiful sense of nature is spilling out. It's really very neat. And so here, I don't know. I don't think these are actual thistles that he printed. This looks woodblock carved, but it echoes something found in nature, maybe flowers, some thistles, and then the wrinkles or the folds sort of suggest the stems of these flowers. And here above is this beautiful articulated leaf, and I'll zoom in so you could see how beautiful the leaf is printed. And again, the leaf being placed precisely where the artist wanted it. It works in perfect counterbalance with this sort of check design, which is so typical of Gen Yamaguchi. You always see this form that anchors the composition. And in this case, there's a lot going on this side. So this sort of check form creates a really interesting counterbalance. Whereas in this design, a lot of what is happening, most of the activity in the design is happening at the top. And so this sort of rectangular form holds the elements in place. It also helps create a three-dimensional effect between this string that seems to sort of hover and then these forms and the leaf. This sort of recedes into the background as well. It's very interesting. Whereas in this print, you also get that three-dimensional effect. This almost looks like a wand of some kind, and it looks like you could almost hold it, and it's so close. It's so close to the viewer, whereas this sort of envelope-like form is in the background, and then you have this beautiful light emanating that's sort of cascading out from this package-like form. So I'm going to zoom in so that all of you can see. Now with Gen Yamaguchi prints, you sometimes just find his GY seal. This is, of course, a pencil signature. On this particular print, his GY seal is very faint because of the background is so dark, but it's there. There's the GY. And so, for his early period prints, these are the GY seal is very typical on these early pieces. And the last work by Gen Yamaguchi is also a work of abstraction with leaves, but in this case, it's completely just leaves. There is no other elements in the design. There's no check board, a little wand-like check that you sometimes see. There's no rectangular form. This is just leaves. And it's actually kind of an anomaly for Yamaguchi because he usually, as I mentioned, anchors the design. But I think the way that he stacked these leaves, that this darker leaf kind of creates that sort of anchor that he likes to convey in his compositions. And so even though it's not there, this leaf certainly does that job. And I just want to point out just how beautifully these leaves have been inked and printed onto the paper. And they're done in very, very different ways. He chooses ink on this leaf that highlights the veins. This leaf is inked in a way where you don't really see the veins. It's more about the shape. And on this leaf, again, you get to see the veins. But he has different techniques of different applications of thickness of the pigment so that he gets different effects from each leaf, which I find really interesting. And the background here looks like it's been printed with a woodblock. And like this print, there is a really wonderful layer of mica that has been sprinkled across the paper surface, but it's very hard to capture on my phone here. So you just have to imagine that you see this sort of glistening because it's beautiful. So I'm going to zoom in so you can actually see the detail of the background. I'm going to back out. I just sort of want to show this table, these fantastic four prints that are, these designs, these particular designs are extremely rare to find. And I've never seen this design before in 25 years of collecting and dealing, as well as this one. I've only seen it once, and also as this one. These three probably are unique works by Gen Yamaguchi. They're not illustrated in any of the Gen Yamaguchi literature or any references of any museum that I've been able to track down. And of course, this Onchi work, which is also extraordinarily rare, works by Onchi never really come up for sale. You really have to know people in order to acquire one. But it is possible, considering that this is not a monoprint and they have come up for sale, but usually privately. So, but it's really wonderful to be able to show, all four works together. And I wish all of you could actually be here so you could sort of feel the presence of each work, because each of these prints really work well together. There's this wonderful conversation. Just lastly, I'll mention that the seasons of course, are very important for all cultures and in art, but in particular, the Japanese really connect to each season and to each change of the season. And it's not surprising that these works were produced by Japanese artists. To actually utilize to utilize objects that are found in nature to produce works of pure abstraction, but at the same time that oscillate between something that's completely abstract and at the same time, realistic in the sense that it does look like what was used to create it. Conceptually, this is a really wonderful sort of idea that your mind plays with when you're looking at these designs. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining me today on a very late edition of Woodblock Wednesday. I want to encourage all of you to visit my website, collectingjapaneseprints.com, for wonderful works of art that you could look at, read about. I also have a bookstore where there's wonderful books that you could purchase. And of course, you could purchase the prints as well. And just look out for future exhibitions coming your way. We're working hard on finishing the last update to my current exhibition. We're going to add a few more prints, and we're working on our next exhibition, our big fall exhibition, which should go up live at the beginning of November. So thanks again for joining me, and we'll see you next week on Woodblock Wednesday. Thank you.